The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from listeners like you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and generous contributions from listeners like you.
Thanks for everybody for coming. It's great to be here. And when you invited me, I don't think it was a moment of hesitation. I said, of course I'll come and speak. And had I known that there was food on offer, it wouldn't even been a millisecond. That if you want to get a journalist anywhere, just provide some food and they'll show up. I don't know if it's not catered, it's not really journalism. We kind of say, certainly on the sports front with my sporting colleagues, if it ain't catered, it ain't sports journalism, they used to say. And also thank you guys for creating this program and these series of lectures. Beyond the Headlines, I love that theme. And as a journalist, and particularly as a foreign correspondent, there were so many times that we would so dearly desire and want to take our readers behind the headlines, behind kind of the images, the short messages, the notions that are conveyed in headlines, and sometimes even beyond the words of the stories. And I think that's becoming increasingly more our desire to go beyond the headlines, behind the words in our stories, as the stories in a lot of papers unfortunately continue to get smaller or shrink as, I guess, attention spans continue to shrink, or at least that's the interpretation of our editors. They say shrinking attention spans, keep the stories tight, keep the stories short. And so an opportunity to go beyond the headlines is a great delight and a distinct luxury and privilege. And the lamentable thing on the issue of global hunger is that there's basically so few headlines to begin with. It seems to be a problem that we so blithely accept or casually skip over. And perhaps we've seen too many pictures like these of starving children, of the distended bellies, of bone-thin arms and legs, flies circulating around their heads. It's uncomfortable. It's shameful, and we don't want to be uncomfortable. We don't want to be shamed. We don't want to feel bad. I guess perhaps when emergencies arise, after tsunami or after the earthquakes or horrible drought that causes situations like this. But emergencies happen. These pictures come. These pictures go. But that's not what most of the hunger is in the world today. Most of the hunger in the world today is chronic. It's daily. It's all the time. As Jamie said, this year, more than the number of hungry in the world soared past 1 billion people. 1 billion people that go to bed hungry every night. 1 billion. I mean, less than 10% of those 1 billion are the emergency hungry. The other 90%, more than 90%, are hungry every day. It's an everyday, chronic grinding in their stomachs. Theirs, as I said, is a chronic hunger. It's become kind of part of the, I guess, for many of us, and even for me as a longtime correspondent in Africa, it's these pictures, these scenes become almost kind of the background noise of Africa, the wallpaper of Africa, and the developing world. It's as if we become a nerd to scenes like this. It takes a lot of stamina to care about the hunger on a constant daily basis. And so the headlines mainly come on an emergency basis, like in Haiti, that we were reminded again of the vast number of people there that were without food. They come on an emergency basis and they fade, and they come back again when the next emergency arises. Other problems seem more pressing, more shocking. Let me show you this, one set of headlines. Don't know how clearly you can see that. I have the hard copy here. This is a very expensive headline. It's a full-page ad on the back of the Wall Street Journal. Having worked at the Wall Street Journal, it used to be that this would cost $100,000 for a full-page ad. I don't know if that's still the price, if it's gone up with Mr. Murdoch, if it's come down, what it is, but if you can see that, it's an ad from Allstate Insurance. If 12 fully loaded jumbo jets crashed every year, something would be done about it. Every year, more than 4,000 teens die in car crashes. This is an ad to get our attention, headlines to get our attention of the number of teens that die in car crashes. And as the father of two teenage children, it's something I certainly pay attention to. It's awful. It shouldn't happen. It's shameful. And in the text, which I don't have here, but the text says, when even one plane crashes, the story is in the headlines for weeks. But the equivalent of 12 planes full of teens dying every year is barely a blip on the national radar. All right? This is the equivalent of 12 fully loaded jumbo jets crashing every year. Now, as we write in the preface of our book, just for context, UN Health and Food Organizations calculate that 25,000 people throughout the developing world die every day from hunger and malnutrition and related diseases. It's 4,000 a year. It's horrible. Shouldn't happen. Shouldn't be tolerated. 25,000 a day die of hunger. Or, as officials of the United Nations World Food Program have grimly noted, it's the equivalent of 60 jumbo jets crashing every day. 12 a year. That's horrible. Where's the headlines for that, Allstate says? I say, where's the headlines for the 60 that crash every day? It's awful. It shouldn't be tolerated. Where's our ad on hunger? Where's the headlines on hunger? So again, thank you very much for this chance to have this opportunity to go beyond the headlines, or even to create headlines that may not be there, and the few headlines that may exist. Let me first say a little bit about what brought me to stand here before you guys tonight. Last summer, just to digress for a few seconds, I was at a narrative nonfiction writers conference in Dallas. And there were a number of leading literary lights there, and the only reason that I was there is that it was being run by a former colleague at the Wall Street Journal, one of my mentors when I first joined the paper back in 1980. And one of the main draws at this conference was Paul Theroux, the novelist and travel writer. And even though he and I share kind of the same pronunciation of the last name, I can assure you we're not related. He's from the French side of the family, and I'm from the Pomeranian side of the family. But in his speech, Paul Theroux said something. He was explaining the difference between nonfiction writing and fiction writing, since he does both, and does both extraordinarily well. Fiction writing, he said, comes from within. You construct the story, the scenes, the characters from your own imagination, and perhaps they're based on reality, but otherwise it's something that's coming from within. In nonfiction writing, he said, you go out into the world and you seize a story. And I thought that was very profound. I wrote it down in my notebook. So I was taking notes from these guys, hoping, either through their words or through some kind of osmosis to kind of absorb their literary genius. I wrote down in my notebook, you go out into the world and seize a story. And next to my notes that I wrote, I made a slight change to fit my own case. I wrote, I went out into the world, and a story seized me. That story was hunger. It became my calling, in particular after the Ethiopian famine of 2003. And I made a number of trips to Ethiopia there, and we'll get more into that as we go along. After that experience, and what I saw there, and the writing that I did there, and the questions that prompted in my mind, kind of all other stories began paling in comparison to the hunger story. That's the one that I wanted to to settle down and write. As foreign correspondents, we travel all over the world, where you go from story to story. Rarely do you go back and visit a place to see how people are doing. It's from one to the next. I figured, no, this is what I'm here to write about. This is what my foreign corresponding had led me to do. So after the Ethiopian famine in 2003, I spent the next several years still overseas with the journal, focusing on hunger, and as Jamie said, writing a series of stories. A number of them with Scott Kilman, who's in the Chicago Bureau and the journal's great agriculture writer. So for as long as I was overseas, Scott's been writing about agriculture, not only in the United States, but how it impacts also farmers and agriculture decision makers around the world. And at one point, and then eventually I moved back to the States. I'm originally from Crystal Lake, Illinois. So after all this time overseas, I figured I'd test the old adage that you can't come home again. And I came home to Highland Park. I didn't get all the way home, so I'm still an hour away from Crystal Lake, so there's still some distance. So I guess I haven't gone all the way home again, so I don't know the veracity of that truism. So Scott and I were reunited in the Chicago Bureau. Now back in the States, I was writing more about domestic hunger, poverty in the United States. But at one stage I told Scott that, hey Scott, my soul, and I assume yours too, our souls won't rest until we put all that we've written about, all that we've learned on hunger, into a book. And through that book we can have a more powerful narrative, grab people more, as Jamie said, outrage and inspire, and kind of drive the narrative at that stage. And the book came out in June, I guess, so 8-9 months ago. And I've got to say that my soul is as restless as ever. Writing the book didn't help. The hunger issue still has seized me. It still grabs me. My soul is as restless as ever to continue to tell the story. So that's why after 30 years, as Jamie explained, I left the Wall Street Journal at the end of the year and basically decided I need to plunge all in and go full steam into the hunger issue. So now I'm at the Council on Global Affairs, which has been the catalyst, in a sense, for President Obama's global hunger and food security push and to end hunger through agriculture development aid, and it's become one of the pillars of his foreign policy. I'll talk more about that a little later too. And at the council, I'm a senior fellow for global agriculture and food policy. I'm not exactly sure what that is. I guess as a journalist, we kind of always figured I don't know what senior fellows are, and kind of a fuzzy thing. It's like being a vice president or something. There must be hundreds of them. So what's a senior fellow do? So I'm still trying to figure that out. So in the meantime, I just call myself a jolly good fellow. And leave it at that, but there's nothing jolly about my mission, because my mission remains the same, to basically take people beyond the headlines of hunger and to take them to the ramparts on the war on hunger. So welcome tonight to what I call, and Jamie alluded to this, to what I call my Outrage and Inspire tour. Scott a lot of times comes along with me. He was deadline pressures and other matters that he couldn't come here. Tonight, of the Outrage and Inspire, Scott's mainly the Inspire, and I'm the Outrage. So since Scott's not here, you're stuck with me and you get a full blast of the Outrage tonight, so you might want to strap yourselves in for that. But Outrage and Inspire, these are the words and emotions that lie behind the headlines of the global hunger issue. They're two very powerful weapons in mobilizing the world to feed the hungry and driving this narrative of the hunger story. At least they are for me as a writer. They're kind of the two weapons that I have in crafting and spreading this narrative of the hunger fight. And Outrage and Inspire, that was the mantra that Scott and I had the whole time as we were writing the book. And during the many moments of writer's block, if you would have looked in on us, it wouldn't have been a particularly pretty sight, but had you looked in on us, you could have seen us kind of mumbling in some kind of harmonic trance almost, outrage and inspire, because that's the goal. That's what we wanted to accomplish. It was the two goals of our writing. If nobody took anything away from the book except being outraged in the first part of the book, inspired in the second part, that's what we were trying to do. Outrage that we brought hunger with us into the 21st century. After the Green Revolution was one of the great technological and scientific wonders and achievements of the 20th century. And not only have we brought hunger with us into the 21st century, we brought it with us in ever-increasing numbers. You know, here we are in the first decade, starting the second decade now of the 21st century, and as we said, the number of hungry has soared past 1 billion people this year. Again, 1 billion. 1 billion people that are chronically hungry and going to bed hungry every night in a world that is producing enough food to feed everybody, for everybody to have the proper caloric intake to lead an active life. 1 billion. That's the absolute highest number in history. We're going in reverse. Inspire. That hunger is the one great problem of our time that we can actually do something about, that we can conquer. We have the know-how, we have the tools, we have the experience, we've got the science, we have the technology. It's the one problem that we can all make a difference on. Individuals matter. Everybody can play a role in this. And ending hunger can be the singular achievement of our generation. The singular achievement. We can get this done. It'll take a while, but if we basically dedicate this decade, this can be the decade of ending hunger. You know, the past weekend I was at Auburn University, and at a summit meeting of a coalition called Universities Fighting Global Hunger. It's about 120, 130 universities around the world. Most of them are in the United States, but there's African universities, Asian, African universities, some from Canada. And there were about 200 students at this summit, and they were representing about 24 or so universities that are manning the ramparts in the fight against hunger. And one of their slogans was, their main slogan was, "Our time is now." And that's absolutely right. And it's critical. For today, we find ourselves basically at this great moment of opportunity in the battle against hunger. Actually, it's a moment of a great moment of potential opportunity. You know, the Obama administration, since its first minutes in office, has made ending hunger through agriculture development one of its top foreign policy priorities. It's been flying very much under the radar as we become consumed with the health care debate and with the two wars that are raging, with you know, relations with Iraq, with Russia, with China, with other hot spots in the world. But there is this kind of under the radar foreign policy that's going on that they're making steady progress on alleviating hunger through global development. In his inaugural address, if you remember, President Obama said, "To the people of poor nations, we pledge to work alongside you to make your farms flourish and let clean waters flow, to nourish starved bodies and feed hungry minds." 30 words. That's all that is. It's 30 words. That's all it took to construct and begin constructing this pillar of foreign policy. Since then, he's talked about this and tried to drive action at the G8 meetings, at the G20 meetings, get his fellow stateswomen to get the money together on this. Hillary Clinton, in all her travels around the world and her travels to Africa, this is something that she keeps hammering on and talking about. It's what they call a whole of government approach. It's not just the State Department. It's the White House. It's coordinated by the National Security Council. It's the Pentagon. It's the Global Security Initiative. It's Treasury. It's USDA. It's USAID. It's this initiative that is consuming many parts of the government. We'll see how that is and how they can all work together. It being Washington with fiefdoms and budget battles and who controls what. But at least that's what they're trying to do. And it's also beginning to take shape on the ground in Africa. Rwanda is looking like that'll be the first country where they start deploying this increased agriculture development and trying to reverse the decades of horrible neglect of the African farmers. Ghana, there's some things going on the ground, and in Uganda too. So what we have emerging finally, is this political leadership and this political will that's been missing all these years on the hunger issue. And finally, political leadership from the top. And what the administration has seen, and I think propelling some of this, is what they see happening from the bottom, and kind of this grassroots movement and clamor and momentum that is arising in faith-based organizations, in NGOs, in corporate boardrooms, on college campuses. All you guys being here tonight and the interest that you're showing, what I saw at Auburn University and the great enthusiasm of the students that are involved there and the faculty And we also see it among philanthropists. Bill Gates, in a speech that he gave at the World Food Prize in Des Moines in October, I think it was, said that his foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and all the billions that they're spending on education, on health, particularly in the developing world, and on agriculture, what they've decided and concluded is that the best way to reduce the poverty of these very poorest countries is through focusing on the small farmers, the poorest of the poor. And it is through kind of creating the conditions for them to be as productive as possible so they can feed their families, they can feed their villages, hopefully feed their countries, hopefully have some surplus that they can sell, that the countries can export, that they can make some money. That will be the engine for driving prosperity and lifting these countries out of the situations that they're in. So finally what we're seeing, after a couple of decades, we're reversing things. The poor farmers aren't the problem. And that's what we've thought for the last couple of decades through World Bank philosophy, IMF philosophy, this notion of structural adjustment. The poor were the problem. The farmers were the problem. Now we're seeing they're not the problem anymore, they're the solution. And that's also at the heart of Obama's, what they popularly call Feeding the Future program. So now is the time to seize on this rising momentum that we see kind of coming up from the grassroots, and hopefully then to encourage the leadership at the top to say, hey, there's this movement down here that is ready to join, that is ready to follow. We've been waiting for some movement from the top. And so the time to seize on this moment, this potential moment, and that this time and this opportunity isn't squandered. And so here's where the outrage and inspiration comes in. Because outrage and inspiration are really vital to setting this grassroots ablaze and creating this momentum and shaking off the complacency and reversing the neglect that has driven hunger to these historic highs. 1 billion people at the beginning of the 21st century. It's appalling. Outrage, as we've noted, that 25,000 people die every day of hunger, malnutrition, and related diseases. We had the comparison of the jumbo jets. Here's another comparison. 25,000 a day is 3 times as many daily deaths as occurred during the 1999 genocide in Rwanda, when an average of 8,000 people were killed each day during a 100-day orgy of killing. 3 times that amount die of hunger. Now there's an international criminal tribunal to deal with those deaths and from that resulted from the genocide and the horrible slaughter that went on there. But what about those dying of hunger? Where's the international tribunal for those? Where's the outrage? Outrage that investment in agriculture development, particularly in Africa, dramatically disappeared in the past couple of decades. It slumped from $8 billion a year in the 1980s. I think it reached a high point in 1984. $8 billion a year from the rich countries to the poor countries for agriculture development aid. From $8 billion in the 1980s to less than $3 billion earlier this decade. Fell off the edge of a table. Outrage that the rich world agricultural subsidies amounted to $260 billion in 2007. Primarily from the United States and Europe, but then the Brazilians, the Chinese, the Japanese, everybody else gets in on the subsidies. $260 billion in 2007 that we're subsidizing our farmers. Well, we told African governments not to spend one single dollar on subsidizing their farmers. If they did, at the risk of losing loans from the World Bank, losing development projects from USAID, the British DFID, and others. That was under this misguided policy of structural adjustment that hopefully now is in the past. Outrage that as a result of this, that African farmers, alone among the farmers of the world, bear 100% of the risk of an inherently risky business, of a very risky business. Look, if a crop fails in the US or Europe, in most cases somebody's writing a check, and in most of the cases it's a government or it's an insurance company. If a crop fails in Africa, people die. Ain't nobody writing a check. Not allowed to write a check. Not allowed to subsidize. That's your problem. Outrage that the American food aid system has refused to modernize, to go to a little bit of cash purchase In the book, we suggest maybe 50% of our food aid budget in some cash, rather than all food, which is the program, which is what's mandated by American government, that all our food aid has to be American-grown food shipped on American-flagged ships, even though it may be going to a region of the world where there's plenty of surplus food there, because there's a grand paradox in every hunger zone in the world, usually surplus in one part of the country, horrible famine, horrible hunger in another part of the country. But still, our homegrown American food aid goes there halfway around the world, taking months to do on very expensive American-flagged ships. The result being that in Ethiopia in 2003, during the horrible famine there when 14 million people were on the doorstep of starvation, America spent more than $500 million sending food aid to feed starving Ethiopians. Saved a lot of lives. Hooray for that. $500 million in food aid to feed starving Ethiopians. That same year, in 2003, the U.S. spent less than $5 million on agriculture development aid that would have helped Ethiopian farmers grow more food, so they wouldn't be in the position of having to need of food aid and American food aid to begin with. Horribly skewed. $500 million in food aid, less than $5 million in agriculture development aid. Outrage that so much of the chronic hunger today is largely man-made. You know, now certainly there's natural disasters and acts of God that trigger famine and horrible hunger situations. There's droughts, there's tsunamis, there's the earthquake. You know, and of course hunger follows in the wake of wars, of conflict, of the corruption that still plagues Africa and other places in the developing world all too often, and that has to stop too. But so much of today's hunger is caused by bad policy spanning the political spectrum in the rich world and the poor, and that's avoidable. There's neglect through this decline in agriculture development spending. There's hypocrisy, as we've seen with the subsidies. There's good intentions gone bad. Our food aid policy that defies reform. There's the self-interest of Western countries, of ourselves, our self-interest, that often puts our interest ahead of those of the people that we're supposed to be helping, puts our interest ahead of the interest of the hungry. Outrage, and here's the most recent one that's got me going. Outrage that already there are some voices in Congress muttering that President Obama's commitment to this global hunger and food security initiative, which he got the G20 leaders to pledge $22 billion to, that the U.S. commitment of $3.5 billion over 3 years, $3.5 billion over 3 years for agriculture development assistance in the developing world to begin to reverse these horrible trends, that's too much. Hey, don't you know we're in a financial crisis? They say. You know, where are we going to get the money from? Well, look, these guys in Congress, they came up with $3 billion very quickly, and they spent it over a couple of months in their Cash for Clunkers program last summer. $3 billion spent very quickly to get crappy cars off the road. They can find billions of dollars for that, but basically the same amount of money spent over three years, all of a sudden then they become cheap. We don't have the money for that. So what are they saying? The hungry of the world are the clunkers of the world, and we don't have enough money for them. When they complain, we don't have enough money. They have the money. So, as I said, outrage kind of fills the first part of the book. You know, I was hoping we were succeeding with that when we sent off the manuscript in the first draft to the publisher. And one day I called the copy editor to clear up a style question, and she answered the phone with a bit of agitation. I kind of tried to cheer her up and say, "Oh, how's it going?" And I asked, and she responded, "I'm infuriated." I mean, the last thing you want to hear from an editor is the word infuriated. I mean, believe me, nothing good has ever come from an infuriated editor. I've dealt with hundreds of them. Nothing ever good comes. What's wrong, I asked. I figured there was some kind of mistake, or we kept repeating the same goofy grammatical mistake or something, overuse of semicolons or some kind of other, these or those or which are that or something that we kept screwing up. And she said, no, it's a good infuriated. I've just finished reading the chapter on subsidies. So I said, okay, I thought the outrage is working. And then she asked, tell me, does it get more hopeful? And I said, yes, it does get more hopeful, because with the outrage comes the inspire. And with the inspire comes the inspiration. And with the inspire comes the motivation. And the motivation to get busy and to get to the bottom of the hunger issue. So this is our task that I'd like everybody to think about and join and man the ramparts with us. Raise the clamor. We need to raise the clamor that hunger won't be tolerated, and a clamor that will be heard loud and clear in Washington and in the capitals around the world. And a determination, let's make ending hunger the next great populist cause, or as I said, the populist cause of this generation. And fortunately, we've got great precedents on our side. The clamor has been raised in recent years on a number of humanitarian issues. We've seen policies change, great sums of money raised, millions of lives saved. If you remember the Jubilee 2000 campaign, those campaigners barged into international politics and put the issue of debt relief for the poorest nations on the front burner. When the Jubilee 2000 campaign came to the United States in 1999, 2000, at the turn of the millennium, one of its main proponents was Bono, the Irish rock star, and he can outrage with the best of them. And Bono met with members of Congress, and he told them, hey, he told them about the great suffering that was being caused by these debt payments that had to be paid. More money was going out of countries than was coming in development aid, and it was just paying the debt, servicing the debt on the interest. And he said, was stressing the urgency of granting debt relief and this Jubilee period of forgiveness that was coming, and this movement coming out of the churches of the UK. A number of congressmen said, hey, Bono, you're absolutely right. We understand. We get it. But when I go home to my constituency, I don't hear any clamor on this issue. All right, that was the wrong thing to tell Bono. He huddled with his colleagues, and basically they said, hey, they want clamor. We'll give them clamor. So he went on a Heart of America tour. It was a bus ride in the middle of winter or in early December. And he went from Omaha to Nashville. Didn't bother with the elites in New York or the Hollywood crowd in California. Heart of America tour. He traveled by bus and without his band. The U2 guys, they were back in Ireland in the studio. He went to universities, schools, churches, truck stops, donut stores. Says he overdosed way too much on Krispy Kremes. And he was spreading the impact of Africa's heavy debt load. He was spreading the outrage over the impact of Africa's heavy debt load and the expanding AIDS crisis. The resulting grassroots clamor that he raised, that he ignited, was heard in the halls of Congress and in the White House. Legislation moved. American leadership was galvanized. The cold hearts of bean counters in capitals around the world and international financial institutions melted. And billions of dollars of debt was forgiven, wiped off the books. Why not hunger? A multitude of AIDS activists then followed up on the success of that and said, hey, now let's focus on the devastation of the AIDS epidemic. A global fund was created. Soon billions of dollars was pouring into the global fund. AIDS drugs rushed into Africa to corral that scourge, and hooray for that. Why not hunger? Environmentalists have elevated climate change, global warming, to the top of the global political agenda. Why not hunger? Late last year, there were two prominent global summits that went on. There was a World Food Summit in Rome, and then a couple weeks later, there was this global climate change summit in Copenhagen. No rich country leader went to the food summit in Rome, except for Berlusconi, but he was the host. And then shortly after that, he was back in Milan, and he got clattered in the face by that statue. But they all went to Copenhagen. And in Copenhagen, you could probably remember, they were tripping all over themselves to get in front of the microphone to pontificate on the climate change and global hunger, on global warming issue. Why not hunger? For without ending hunger, which is basically the common enemy of all development issues, it's the fundamental element of development. Without ending hunger, none of these campaigners on any of these other issues can claim success. I mean, look, all the AIDS medicine that's rushing into Africa, it doesn't really have the impact it should in hungry, malnourished bodies. There's a very pointed African saying this. It's one of my favorite. The Africans will say, look, giving such drugs to a hungry person is like washing your hands and then drying them into dirt. What good does it do? Look, what does all of our medicine say? What's on the little bottle or the prescription thing? Take with food. Take with food. Didn't need that in Africa? Give them the drugs. Don't need to deal with the food issue. Why not hunger? And on climate change, I mean, success is going to depend on having the people who are said to be and predicted to be most impacted by climate change, the poor farmers in Africa, in the Sahelian area and around the equator. They're going to need, so they can adapt to still feed their families and their communities. They're going to need new water harvesting techniques, new irrigation systems, kind of drought-resistant seeds. So why not hunger? Raise the clamor. Spread the outrage. This can be the great populist cause of our time. You know, for Scott and I, our outrage began when we were researching a story on Norman Borlaug. There he is. Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution. Still a young man in this picture. It was for a story we were doing in 2002. And Scott and I were wondering, well, why did the Green Revolution never get to Africa? Why can't the Africans feed themselves? Why was hunger increasing in Africa while it had been on the retreat in other parts of the world, and after the success in the 1960s and 70s in a lot of the Asian countries? How would Africa have been left behind? We came across a passage from Borlaug's lecture upon winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, which he won for his work on the Green Revolution. It's very haunting when you hear this now, even more so now that Dr. Borlaug, there he is at 93, still manning the ramparts of the hunger fight, his efforts, the war still not finished. Even more so haunting now that he died last summer at the age of 95. Dr. Borlaug said in 1970, so what is that, 40 years ago now, he said, man can and must prevent the tragedy of famine in the future instead of merely trying with pious regret to salvage the human wreckage of the famine, as he has so often done in the past. We will be guilty of criminal negligence without extenuation if we permit future famines. Criminal negligence. You know, the light went off for Scott and me. That's what we were as we're writing about hunger. We're crime reporters. I mean, what else would you call it? 25,000 people dying of hunger and malnutrition-related diseases every day. It's the crime of our age. What else would you call it when we've got 1 billion people now that are going to bed hungry? We were crime reporters. Then came the Ethiopian Famine of 2003, and it was Borlaug's prophecy come to life, or rather come to death. I went to Ethiopia. I was based in Zurich, Switzerland at the time, writing about humanitarian development issues. So I went to Ethiopia, which was the scene of the crime. As I mentioned, in 2003, 14 million people were on the doorstep of starvation. Now, far fewer died than in the famine of 1984, which for those of us of a certain age will all remember is kind of a galvanizing, moment, kind of global hand-holding at the Hor, the We Are the World, the Live Aid concerts, the We Are the World song. But far fewer, and in that one in 1984, about a million people, they figure, died. Because the government was a communist government and basically wasn't letting, but they were denying that there was a famine. But in 2003, the 14 million people that were on the verge of our starvation was more than were actually imperiled by starvation in 1984, when there were maybe 10 or 12 million. So far fewer died, but more were vulnerable. And the government in Ethiopia in 2003 was loudly ringing the bells, and the relief agencies came, but it was still a catastrophic hunger calamity. What we wrote about then, or what I wrote about then, was that the markets failed before the weather did. The years of neglect of agriculture development spending were made cruelly manifest. The impact of our food aid and our subsidies policies were more clear than ever. On my first day in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, the capital, one relief worker with the World Food Program, Voli Karuchi, was giving me a briefing of what we would be seeing the next days as we went out to the hunger zones. He gave me this piece of advice. It was a warning of sorts. It's been one of our motivating things in writing the book, along with Dr. Borlaug's passages. Voli's told me, looking into the eyes of someone dying of hunger becomes a disease of the soul. You see that nobody should have to die of hunger. A disease of the soul. I mean, wow. I had, as have the rest of us here who have traveled to Africa, had all sorts of medical warnings. You know, take your yellow fever shots, make sure you have the malaria pills, watch out for the cholera areas, pay attention to the meningitis zones, don't stand in standing water for the parasites. A disease of the soul, I mean, that was a new one for me. The next day we were down in the hunger zones in the southern part of the country. And it was then that I looked into the eyes of children dying of hunger for the first time. And I discovered that Voli was right. For the first time I saw that nobody should have to die of hunger. We drove up into the highlands, and there in an emergency feeding tent full of starving children, as I said, I looked into the eyes of a 5-year-old boy, Hargirso. That's Hargirso on the right. He's sitting between the legs of his father, otherwise he would topple over. Hargirso weighed just 27 pounds when he arrived in the clinic a few days before I arrived, and then the rest of us that were in our group. He's the very portrait of famine, as I discussed earlier, swollen head, bone-thin arms and legs, and his eyes. You know, one realized from Voli that what he said is that in a famine, the starving speak with their eyes because they're too weak to speak. Speaking requires too much energy. So the eyes. I mean, Hargirso's eyes, you know, they're remarkable in a frightening way. They're kind of deep black holes. There's no hint of playfulness that you would have with a 5-year-old. There's also no baleful beseeching of somebody in his horrible straits. They're kind of empty, lifeless. His father, Tesfaye, was kind of holding up behind him. He kind of stared blankly right through his son and into space. And his eyes were speaking of guilt and saying, what have I done to my son? What have I done to cause this? And there, in those eyes of father and son, I found my calling. This story seized me. Voli was right. What I saw infected my soul. Their eyes were empty, but what I saw filled me with outrage. Hargirso's dead eyes enlivened mine. I saw wrongs and injustices that I hadn't seen before, that I had seen before but I hadn't noticed before. What I saw indeed became a disease in my soul. I saw things like this. Wow. These are warehouses in Ethiopia in the middle of the famine in 2003. These are bags of produce. Well, let me back up a slide. These guys, these farmers, Hargirso's father and the father of this child next to him. As we know, most of the farmers in Africa are women. The fathers are probably here with the children because they had to carry the children to the emergency feeding tent, and the women were at home still doing the farming and taking care of the other children that were there. But when I talked to these fathers, so full of guilt, what had they done? Because no, it wasn't so much what they had done; it was what we had done. These guys were in a situation of the previous 2 years. This is in 2003, so the farming seasons of 2001, 02, or 2000 and 2001, and 01 and 02, they had the best seasons, the best harvests of their lives. They had surplus. They packed up those surpluses, put them in big bags, put them on their shoulders, and carried them into the same market town. Now, what happens in most places in Africa, when the harvests come, they pretty much immediately go on the market. The storage facilities are so bad. 30, 40, 50% of harvest is usually lost in post-harvest conditions because the storage facilities are so crummy. There's no place to store them, or the rain gets to it, the pests get to it. And so it comes, they bring it to the market. They also need money because to pay off what little debts they have, and they need money just to buy other things. They got to buy some other kind of food that they're not growing. clothes, maybe some things for their little house, and perhaps school fees for the kids. So the harvest goes on the market immediately. Well, you can imagine what happened after 2 surplus years. Prices collapsed. And in Ethiopia, in some parts of the country, they collapsed astonishingly, dramatically, calamitously. They collapsed 80%. Now, if prices collapsed 80% here, it'd be insurrection. These guys acted like farmers anywhere would do. The next year, when it came time for the planting season, they had to cut their costs, cut their expenses. They had planted a surplus. What good had it done? Commercial farmers, and there's some farmers in Ethiopia that have 2,300, 3,000, 4,000 acres of corn and wheat, and kind of, expands and looks like, farms around here in Iowa and in the Midwest. Some of those farmers, we write about them in the book, had their best harvest of their lives, lost $250,000, on the verge of bankruptcy. All these farmers, what do? The commercial farmers took land out of production. They shut off their crude irrigation systems because they couldn't afford the diesel. They're cutting back cost. These peasant farmers, maybe 1, 2, 3 acres, they're cutting expenses. They don't use fertilizer. It's too expensive. They use whatever normal seeds are. They don't use the more expensive hybrid seeds that are going to give them a better yield. They use whatever seeds they have sitting in the back of their huts that they use for emergency situations. As I said, some people turned off their irrigation systems, crude, small systems as they may have been. So they were expecting fewer inputs, less quality inputs. Our harvests are going to be less. We know that going into the 2003 season. That's okay. We had a harvest. What good did it do? We lost money. We hope we can grow enough to feed our families. That'll keep us, that'll be happy. Everyone looks heavenward for rain. The rains didn't come. They were sporadic. Some areas the rains failed. Crops failed. Hunger sets in. Hunger tips to famine. These farmers who 1 year before were carrying their big bags of surplus grain to this very same market were suddenly carrying their starving kids. It was a turnabout of biblical proportions. Feast tipped into famine. From the farmer's success came their failure. As we wrote, the markets failed before the weather did. There were no market conditions to absorb their harvest. After the famine of 1984 and the terrible suffering and the We Are the World, Ethiopia and a lot of countries in Africa went on a push to produce. That was the goal. Nobody thought about market conditions. Nobody thought about, hey, maybe they'll need some roads to move this stuff. Who was thinking, oh, they're going to need storage? Finally, the push to produce came to fruition. Best harvest ever turns into famine. Markets failed before the weather did. These are staggering pictures. This is German Amente, Ethiopian farmer, grain trader. He would aggregate from the smaller farmers, buy their crops, wheat, corn, soybeans, lentils, peas, and he would store it. There are some of the bigger farmers that have, kind of cinder block, mud brick warehouses. They're not climate controlled. They're not pest controlled. If there's a moth, they basically get out the fly swatters and run around and chase the moth. There's nothing that's basically, it just keeps the rain out and kind of the rats and the bigger things. These guys were storing all this grain because had this been put on the market, the 80% collapse would have turned into who knows what, 85, 90%. Even more. I don't know how far prices can collapse. They can, go beyond the floor. So all this grain was sitting in Ethiopia in warehouses. 2 blocks from this man's, from German Amente's warehouse, is the main road that runs from the port in Djibouti. Ethiopia doesn't have a port, so it's the port of Djibouti. And it's from that port that the food aid comes in. Food aid goes into Djibouti, steams into, comes through the desert, up into the highlands, into Addis. This is in the town of Nazareth. That main road, carrying all the food aid, runs 2 blocks from this guy's warehouse. Another warehouse right next door. These guys are wondering, all this food aid is coming in here, mainly American food aid. Can somebody please buy our food first? So these guys are writing a letter to their government, a petition saying, can you please tell our donors, first of all, thank you for the food aid because it's saving a lot of lives. Secondly, can you tell them first to donate cash so you can buy what we have here? Because if you don't buy what we have here, we're going to be in the same cycle as next year. We need money from the sale of this to buy the next year's harvest, and we need space to store it. We'll be in the same situation of everything going on the market at the same time and prices collapsing. So they're writing to their government, please have the donors first spend cash to buy our things. I'm in Ethiopia. Scott's in the United States. He's in the Palouse area of Washington State, where a lot of food aid revenue comes in for the wheat and the lentils and the pea growers. The American Farm Associations, led by the Wheat Association, at the very same time that these guys are writing their petition, are writing another petition. Their petition goes to the American government and to the White House and says, hey, we've had a great bumper crop of wheat this year in the United States. It's putting pressure on our prices. Do you think you can put more wheat in the American food aid system? 2 countervailing petitions. So the Ethiopian farmers come to the conclusion, oh, I think Americans need starving Ethiopians to reduce their surpluses and relieve their prices. American farmers have a market for their crops in Ethiopia. We don't. We don't have a market in our country for our crops. So as an American, it's very hard to hear that and argue that, hey, the Americans, the European farmers, they need starving Ethiopians, they need starving Africans. These 2 guys in all their sartorial splendor, there's a couple of slides left, they're lentil farmers. They're a little bit, maybe a couple miles down this road, coming in from Djibouti into Nazareth. As I said, they're lentil farmers. I'm standing there talking to these guys. They've got their lentil fields a little bit in the back. These guys have been on food aid for a couple of months because their crops had failed the year before. It's green. The next year's harvest is still in the ground. And so they're in the hunger season. They're getting the food aid until that harvest comes along, hopefully better. So they're standing there. We're standing there. And a big double-wide convoy of food aid trucks rumbles past. And as that's going by over the roads, and the roads are potholed, and some stuff from the bags is falling out on the road. These guys and myself, and they're curious, oh, what is that fell out? Again, they're lentil farmers. Trucks go by. It's all clear. They run out into the middle of the road. They bend over. Well, what was that? They pick it up. It's lentils. They say to me, don't Americans know that we grow lentils here? Can somebody buy our lentils? And again, this is the discrepancy. Can somebody help us grow more lentils, grow the best lentils we can? $500 million in food aid, in American food aid in 2003 to Ethiopia, to feed starving Ethiopians. Less than $5 million in agriculture development aid to help these guys grow more lentils so they don't be in this position to begin with. These 2 guys are standing on the banks of the Rib River, which is one of the source rivers for the Blue Nile, which is one of the great mighty rivers of Africa. This man's name with the turban on his head is Tesfahun Belachu. Tesfahun in Amharic means be hope. But when I saw these guys, he's utterly bereft of hope. His fields had also dried up the year before. They're on food aid for the last couple of months. But he's standing next to this river. So I hey, you've got this water here. I mean, can't you use this water to irrigate your fields? And he kind of fixes me with his gaze like I'm some kind of idiot. He says, of course, we thought about that. We've tried it. But 1, we don't have enough money to sustain it, to keep it going. It was a very crude system. And 2, our government, our police officials tell us to come down and take it away. It's illegal. This water belongs in Egypt. Years of water policies and geopolitics of food and water had basically dictated and declared that the Blue Nile water belongs to the downstream users in Egypt and Sudan. Ethiopia had the great benefit and the great advantage of never being colonized by a European power. Ethiopia also had the great disadvantage of never being colonized by a European power, because when the European powers got together and said, well, what do we do about Africa? The Brits, who were in charge of Egypt and Sudan, said, oh, we'll take the Nile water. Ethiopia, they don't need that. There's nobody representing them. The Blue Nile runs into the White Nile, coming up from Central Africa. Together in Khartoum, they come together and they form the Great Nile. And the Great Nile runs through Sudan and then through the Sahara in Egypt. And it brings the Sahara to life, and it's been the granaries of civilization since the pharaohs. 85% of the water in the Great Nile running through the Sahara in Egypt comes from the Blue Nile and from other rivers in Ethiopia. 85%. But they can't use it. So what you had in the famine of 2003 was this man is an Egyptian farmer. He's using water. His farm, 60 acres, cornucopia of all sorts of things. He's got calves, and there's a water buffalo calves. He's 100 miles, as I said, from the main Nile. This water comes through canals. As he said, we've got the last drop of the Nile. He's using the water to water his calves, give his calves a shower. As he says, happy calves, fatter calves, more profit for him when he sells them. 85% of those water drops are coming from Ethiopia and the Ethiopian highlands. Tesfahun, he can't use any of the water. He's on food aid. Ethiopia is starving. One last set of pictures quickly gets to the subsidies. Cotton farmer in Mali, wearing rags, walking behind oxen. Cotton farmer in the American Mississippi Delta, button-down shirt, nice piece of equipment behind him, very intensive, very, very, very costly proposition is cotton farming in America. Which of these two farmers receive subsidies from their government to farm? Not these guys. Ken Hood. He was the head of the American Cotton Council in 2002. These photos were taken on the same day, me in Mali and Scott in Mississippi. Very same day in May, June of 2002. U.S. Farm Bill had just passed. That Farm Bill raised subsidies pretty much across the board for American farmers. When Bush signed it and he turned around, the first person he turned around and shook hands with was this man as the head of the Cotton Council. Cotton subsidies went up by about 16% that year. These guys were told by their government they're going to be basically getting a dime less per unit of cotton because the world price of cotton was depressed because of all the cotton that America was growing based on subsidies, which was dumped on the international market. So one of the great discrepancies and hypocrisies that fuels this. And so I guess what I want to leave with is, so seeing all this basically changed my career. And I determined that I need to write about hunger. I need to take people into the eyes of the starving. And this is what we all need to do. Let's take everyone beyond the headlines and into the eyes of the malnourished and into the eyes of the starving. Let's spread this disease of the soul. Because for heaven's sakes, I mean, we're now in the second decade of the 21st century, and nobody should have to die of hunger. Thank you.
Talked about raising awareness of hunger and prioritizing it, making it a top priority. But it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the bigger issue is how to solve it. I think people are aware others are starving, but then how do you solve it? How do you solve it in countries where property rights are not respected, where the government is corrupt, where entrepreneurship is not encouraged, and where money that's often given to them goes down the drain, is stolen, misappropriated, and so on. Could you please comment?
Yeah, those are all good points that need to be considered. In terms of, raising awareness is one thing, but what do we actually do? There's a lot of advocacy that needs to be done. There's a couple of bills that are in Congress that are there to fund Obama's Feed the Future program. They're kind of languishing there, bogged up as everything else pretty much is, I guess, by the health care debate. But advocacy to basically let the senators, the representatives, the people, in the White House and in the administration, this is an issue that's important. This is an issue that we want you to do it. I mean, these other things that I mentioned. I mean, Debt relief, the same thing was said. Give them debt relief. It's money. It's money down a hole. I mean, that was the big thing of Jesse Helms. He was turned around and became a big supporter of debt relief when he saw the beneficial impact that it would have, and that was huge advocacy and lobbying efforts. There's a lot of examples that we have in the book, and that's the inspire part of kind of people that are doing things on the ground that can make a difference. And when you're dealing basically directly with the farmers of Africa, and you can do that. The money doesn't have to run through governments. It can run through organizations here to farmers on the ground. These are the classic $1 and $2 a day people. They're the salt of the earth. They're not corrupt. They're not going to run off with the money. They're very skilled farmers. They know what they're doing. They're just working in such hideous conditions that working farmer to farmer or efforts that go there, and there's all sorts of them. Every religious denomination, every religion has organizations on the ground. There's a lot of secular organizations. So as I said, this is something that everybody can be involved in. The land rights thing are crucial. That's where a lobbying effort and an education effort on the African governments needs to happen, and also the watchdog. What one needs to do in these countries is really build up the civil society, kind of the watchdogs that say, hey, these agriculture programs are really important for us. 60, 70, 80% of the people in our countries are farmers. Even the people in the rural areas have relatives and folks living off the farm. These are efforts that are important to us. We're watching you, government. We know what money is coming into the country. We got to make and so the Obama plan stresses transparency, accountability, and basically consultation, not only with the government but everybody on the ground. And so, if you can kind of involve the whole grassroots thing, and particularly civil society in Africa, which is very weak, but can strengthen that, that kind of then provides this clamor. The grassroots clamor that I'm talking about from here, you need that grassroots clamor in Africa too that says, let's get this done. It's a disgrace, and for the governments to realize it's a disgrace that we can't feed our people. And some of the more enlightened governments are beginning to realize that. And if the civil society is there to basically support them along the way, I think that'll help a lot. Thank you.
I was going to ask about the virtual water trade as like embodied water in grain, for example, and maybe that's not so limiting. If we can really go back to self-sufficiency with just education and some technology transfer for farmers, is it still required to ship food around the world from water-rich countries to water-poor countries, or what is that right balance? I wonder your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, what you find in Africa is very interesting. You have water-poor countries that are now, it's kind of this new land grab that's going on in Africa. So it's the Indians, the Chinese, the Saudis, the Arab countries, where they're either running out of land, they're running out of water, they've over-fertilized, so they have pollution problems in all these countries. It's the Saudis, don't really grow anything, and the Arab countries. They're all coming into Africa now, looking for big land areas and land concessions from the government. And as you pointed out, I mean, a lot of the land is in the hands of the government or some kind of tribal administration. And there the big question is, hey, it's a good opportunity because we've been clamoring Africa needs agricultural investment. Here comes some agricultural investment from these other countries. But what's that used for? Are they just going to farm, grow, and pull everything out and ship it home as they've done with the timber, the gold, the diamonds, the copper, everything, all the natural minerals of Africa? Are they now going to basically use and pull out the land and the water and the food that they grow? Or do they do that and they share that with the Africans? And when they build an irrigation system from whatever lake to their land concession, they darn well better be making sure that that irrigation is available to all the farmers along the way. The roads that they use also become the farm-to-market roads for the local farmers. Whatever marketing systems they set up, whatever port rehabilitation they do to move the goods to their own countries, that also becomes available to the farmers. And there are African governments and African finance people that are very aware of that. And they said in their own meetings, they say this is something we really got to keep an eye on. But there's parts of Africa that have Ethiopia. despite probably what our popular impression of Ethiopia is, of a terribly drought-stricken, dry place where everybody sits around in the dust, Ethiopia basically has the reputation and is known as being the water source or the water fountain of Africa. It rains in the highlands. When the weather conditions are good and the rain conditions are good in Ethiopia, Ethiopia rivals South Africa as Sub-Saharan Africa's #1 grain and cereal producer. They can grow. But they need the markets, they need the warehouses, they need the storage, they need all this stuff. So an agriculture revolution or an agriculture transformation, the production and ramping up production is kind of the easiest thing. It's all these other things that come along. And here's another point to think about, is that the FAO and the WFP and the UN organizations and USDA, everybody's saying by 2050, we're going to have to double food production because of the increasing population and then the increasing demand from places like China and India, formerly hungry countries that are now more prosperous and are eating better. Africa is basically the final frontier of agriculture. Where is this doubling of food production going to come from in the world? We can be very insular and selfish and say, all these matters we're going to hold on to our own vested self-interest on food aid, on subsidies, on all these other issues. Where's that doubling of food going to come from? And at some time, it's really going to matter to us by high prices, by instability in countries around the world because there are shortages and high prices that are there, that we saw in 2008 with the rioting. It was a food crisis that toppled the government in Haiti 2 years ago. It wasn't the earthquake that toppled the government.
Well, first of all, I'm just so glad that you're out here, that you've been moved to go on a mission to raise these questions. And I think that, I couldn't even sit still really during your presentation.
Thank you.
And I think it's like these questions really, people need to dig into them and look for like what is the solutions. And that's where I have, I think I want to challenge like some of the framework of what you're saying, that, okay, look, from some of what you said yourself, there was this green revolution. Now we have 1 billion people hungry, more than ever in human history. There was this Jubilee 2000, and some debt relief. What has been the trajectory of where all this is going? I think part of the thing is that there's a connection between the wealth of people in some countries and the impoverishment and suffering of people in other countries, that they're mutually coexistent. And in this globalized system the way it is right now, we need a much deeper solution than what you're talking about, much more radical, profound change in the ways that people relate to each other and carrying out production and distribution in the world. The thing that you're posing about, food, farming aid, the continuing developing. I mean, what's the significance of this example in Ethiopia, where they have these years of tremendous surpluses, and it's the capitalist framework of all this, the framework of generalized commodity production, maximizing profit. This is serving well the wealthy countries, not so well because we're in a financial crisis, right? But at the same, I saw 2 days ago an article about Haiti, where in the Associated Press, and it said that the subsidized American rice was flooding into Haiti now and continuing to ruin the already devastated, Haitian economy, the farm production there. Now, I mean, this is the world that we have right now. I just think that I'm not saying they're easy questions, but I don't think the inspiration comes in like, let's continue on the path of aid and development, in the way it's been going. There's got to be like a much deeper going revolution. And so
right. No, you're right. I mean, I think what one has seen is basically a 180-degree reversal of the structural adjustment period of what was called comparative advantage. Because what one saw in Haiti, I think it was in the 1980s or so when this Washington Consensus and this comparative advantage was really popular, era of cheap food. We basically told the Haitians, told the Africans, told all sorts of countries, us the Europeans, those that were the big grain food producers in the world, hey, food is cheap. You in Haiti, your comparative advantages, your peasant farmers, your small farmers, they'd probably be better off working in factories making textiles and underwear. You selling that, using that revenue and buying the food from us because food is cheap. So what happened, I think in the main rice-producing valley of Haiti, over the course of the past 2 decades, production shrunk by like 70 or 75% or something like that. We'll take care of you. We'll sell you the food. 2008, food crisis hits, commodity prices escalate, rice prices soar, the export earnings from the underwear factories that the farmers are working in can only buy X amount of rice as opposed to this much rice. You can buy this much rice. There's shortages in the country. Prices skyrocket in Haiti. There's street rioting. There were riots in, a couple dozen countries in 2008 over food. We hadn't seen that for decades. And so this whole notion of so these development theories and philosophies, I think, are now hopefully discredited. The World Bank has turned around. This Obama initiative is hoping to reverse the neglect. And it will take time. Agriculture in particular can't be turned around quickly. But if there is recognition that, yeah, the what we did in the past was wrong. There's another theory that, had by William Easterly, Dambisa Moyo, and others that have been, the harmful aspects of aid. And there's truth to that. So much aid there's been so much aid, there's little to show for it in many cases. But we can't, I think, to take the extreme position that Africa would be better off without aid is wrong. Because if you apply that, the African agriculture sector has been starved of aid for the past 2 decades. Precisely what they would be prescribing has happened with African agriculture. Under their theory, African agriculture should be flourishing. AIDS decline, private sector should come in, entrepreneurs are doing all sorts of wonderful things. But what's happened is African agriculture has collapsed and disappeared along with the aid. So,
yeah,
sorry, I digress.
My question's back to the subject of policy and advocacy. Basically, how have the Millennium Development Goals affected the world hunger situation? You know that the general outlook of the report is that things are not going so well with the goals that they have.
Right.
Is that the same for hunger issues?
Yeah, it's going horribly. The number one Millennium Development Goal is to reduce, cut hunger and poverty in half, and particularly hunger. And as we've seen on these numbers, it's going in reverse. Hunger's getting worse. It's not getting better. It's not getting halved. It's almost getting, not doubled yet, but it's climbing. The Millennium Development Goals, the good thing about them is they focus people's attention on them. Hey, we've got these set of goals. These are the things that we should attack. And I think when they have the review of these things, there'll be another shockwave that comes across and say, my goodness, we've just gone straight into retreat on the hunger issue. Maybe some of the other issues. I think with the malnourishment and the mother and child survival rates, I think, are getting better in some places. Education, they could probably claim some successes on that. But the number one goal, hunger, they've slammed the car into reverse on that. And I think when they assess that, that'll be a shock, and hopefully it'll then move things that, yeah, we've been so astray on this, and we've really got to do something about this. And that's why they call it a global security effort, because it just hunger leads to failed states. You can't consider that we're living in a successful society when 1 billion people in this world are going to bed hungry every night. And so it's a moral question, and it's a security question. It's what's right, and it's also what's smart that we have to do this.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. The World Beyond the Headlines series aims to bring scholars and journalists together to consider international news stories and how these stories are covered. As a listener, you have come to rely on this program for in-depth analysis of major issues facing our country and our world. But we can only continue our nationally recognized coverage with support from you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and from generous contributions from listeners like you.